This is the next installment in our Hall of Faith series. And really today's discussion is just a continuation of last video's discussion on Jacob. It's really just the storyline that continues, and I feel like it's the other part of the similar discussion. So last time we talked about part of the reason why I think Jacob may end up in the Hall of Faith is because he has to choose to essentially remind his family. He has to pass the torch, and it's not a passive passing of the torch, it's an active passing of the torch. Like he has to choose to remember the story, and then not just remember internally, but remember externally. He has to tell the story. He has to bless the sons. He has to insist that they take him and bury him back in the land of Canaan. He has to remind his children what the story is all about. And I mean, you could see in that last video how moving I found that part of the story to be. This next reference is again a short reference. It's about the next person in the story. So we've learned about Avram, we've heard about Isaac, we've heard about Jacob, and so now you know what's coming next. We're going to hear about Joseph. And Joseph is the other part of this story. So let's read the passage. It's going to be one verse, two verses? Nope, one verse. So another one verse mention for a character. So we've heard about by faith Isaac and by faith Jacob, and now this reference, by faith Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. So by faith Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones, which on some level is an interesting reference, particularly the part that says he spoke as his end was near. He spoke about the exodus from Egypt, because he really doesn't do that, at least directly. Now, I'm not sure what might exist maybe in the Midrash or the Jewish commentary or tradition about additional things that may be being referenced. We've seen the author of Hebrews reference some of those midrashic ideas and thoughts. He references the Exodus maybe in a really indirect way by doing the thing that it does say. He gives instructions about his burial and his bones. Particularly it said instructions concerning the burial of his bones. And so you could say that in an indirect way, that was where and how he was speaking about the Exodus. Rabbi Fohrman's had some incredible stuff that he's written about in both Genesis, a Parashah Companion, and also the Exodus you almost passed over. There's part 4 of that book on the Exodus. Part 4 is actually a whole part concerning Joseph. If I remember, I'll put those 2 books in the description of this video so you can link to those. But again, okay, so here's my big idea. Here's my big takeaway. If Jacob's part in faithfulness, if the reason that he shows up in the Hall of Faith is that Jacob had to be willing to remember his story and remind his family about their story and to plant his flag and to dig his heels in and to insist that what they were experiencing, the comfort, the privilege, the blessing that they were experiencing in Egypt wasn't where the story was supposed to end. Like he had to call that out of the family. He had to remind them of that. He had to make sure that the story of God didn't die out. But the next part of that, I mean, Joseph makes a promise. He makes him an oath before he dies. But then Joseph, and we read about that in Genesis 50, Joseph will go out and he will make good on his promise. He will bury Jacob, his father, in the land of Canaan, just like we're told. And who is there, by the way? The people that attend that funeral, attend that burial, is quite fascinating. And Fohman will talk about that in those resources I've already recommended. But what I find so moving for Joseph's story is Joseph then has to figure out what he's going to do. Will he see his story in Egypt. It was one thing to make a promise to his dad and then to fulfill that promise after his dad had passed away. But now Joseph has to decide which story he wants to belong to. Is he going to? Because if Joseph can make good on his promise, his dad can have this heroic moment. The heroism of Jacob could be true. And if Joseph decides to not follow in his dad's footsteps, to not pursue the path of promise, then the story will die with Joseph. And Joseph has to decide to keep the story going with him. And so by the time he dies, Joseph gives instructions about his bones. So Joseph, who truly has lived, his lived experience has been an experience of blessing, provision. Egypt has been a wonderful place of provision and abundance, more so than his dad. For Jacob, Egypt was just a chapter. For Joseph, Egypt was a huge part of his life. And he has to decide where he stands on the story of God. And he walked in faithfulness. He said, don't bury my bones in Egypt. Make sure you bury my bones in Canaan. Because you see, every single one of us has a part to play in the life of faith. Every single one of us has to keep the story going. Every single one of us has to say, I'm in too. When the writer of Hebrews says, we can't be people that shrink back, it means a lot of things. But it also means, one of the things that it means, is that generation after generation, we have to keep saying, I'm in. I'm in. I say yes to this story too. Just like my dad did, just like his dad did, just like his grandfather did, just like all those people. And so we have to figure out what it means to live the story of faith in our own context. And I think that's something that often gets lost. It gets lost for anybody 2,000 years into the story. You just start to feel like, well, who am I? I'm just a nobody. And if you see yourself as a nobody and choose to let the story, your part of the story, die with you, then everything that would come after you, that part that you play in the great line of what God's doing, completely dies out. Even more so when we aren't Eastern, Hebraic, Jewish thinkers. When we're Western Americans, we might be Gentiles, we're consumers, our culture thrives on individualism. Like, I just don't see myself typically as a part of some grander, bigger story that goes back for generations and generations. It's easy for us just to see ourselves as sure, I'm a character in a story, but who am I? Whether I was here or not here, who really cares? Faithfulness is realizing that you play a part. You have a part to play that only you can play. And if you choose to stop playing that part, if you choose to stop the line, then the line ends. That's where the line ends. Because there's nothing that comes after you, because the story doesn't get passed on. The story doesn't get told with all the people and all the generations that come after us. So Joseph ends up being, in the Hall of Faith, a reminder. And so we had all these people, just to review. We had the first 12 verses of Hebrews chapter 11, the Hall of Faith. We had all these people that believed that there was something bigger, that hope was bigger than their present circumstances. They were putting their faith in this bigger thing. And we're told that all these people died without receiving the promise. But they saw all of this on the distant, that bigger horizon. They saw it, they welcomed it. That's why God's proud to be called their God. He's not ashamed of them. And then we heard about, and then the story starts saying, this is what it looks like to live out this. It's Abraham believing that Isaac would be resurrected. It's Isaac when things don't go the way he has planned at all and the blessings get swapped. It's him believing that God must be in the blessing and pushing the story forward. It's Jacob choosing to insist that the story be held on to, and the closing moments where he could just kind of let it all fade out into the comfortable sunset, and he doubles down and says, no way. It's Joseph that says the story will not end with me. The story will keep going and will be passed on to my kids. What do these things mean for you and I to live the life of faith? Would we live? And we're going to find out, because Hebrews 11 keeps going, and eventually it's going to say something that I find truly inspiring. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We have a lot more characters to listen to in history, a lot more characters to learn from, and a lot more characters who are mapping out the path of faith for us to walk. May we walk it well and honor their legacy, their memory, and this hall of faith. We'll see you in the next video, and we'll talk to you then.